Hi, this is Josh Marshall. This is the Josh Marshall podcast. We got a bunch of things we're going to talk about around the topic of this infrastructure bill. And when I say infrastructure bill, I'm kind of talking about the meta infrastructure bill, which really what I mean by that is Joe Biden's infrastructure agenda proposal that he that the White House then divided up into the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan, which is sort of titles for what we've now come to call hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure. So basically, the first being, surface transportation infrastructure, possibly also the climate component of that, which can feed into surface infrastructure, rail, things to prioritize electric cars, stuff like that, and then soft infrastructure, which may also, climate may come in there, but is more space is basically social safety net and social spending, uh, the caring economy, stuff like that, and then we have a second dynamic of that, which is this kind of two-step process, this sort of linkage and in tandem, where what we have gravitated towards is a model where you're going to do kind of an hard infrastructure mini bill that is bipartisan, and then everything that you can't get Republicans and Democrats to agree on, you put that into reconciliation. And obviously the issue there is this 60 vote set of rules and 50 vote set of rules. So you've got the big picture of all the things that Joe Biden proposed, which runs into trillions of dollars. um you know I lose track of all the different overlapping proposals, but I think you're talking probably a good four, and to some people as much as $6 trillion of spending. So we're going to get into all sorts of aspects of that, and kind of like, is this bipartisan mini bill still happening? Was it ever happening? Because we got in that whole thing, like, they have like, everybody's all excited, and everybody, they have a little, I don't know if it's Rose Garden, but White House press conference, and then suddenly it turns out that they're all upset because he said he wouldn't vote just one of them, and blah 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 blah. And again, sort of like, was there ever an agreement? And is it really true that Biden, saying what they all knew in advance in maybe a slightly different way, really kind of upset the apple cart? And critically, again, we don't really know there ever was an agreement. We had five Republican senators who participated in negotiating this, and I think we're pretty openly committed. Yes, we're for this. And they supposedly spoke for six other Republican senators who we never really quite, with a couple of exceptions, really got a clear sense that they were really on board. And if they weren't on board, the whole thing's moot, because you need at least 10 Republican senators. So if that falls by the wayside, is the whole thing done? Does that mean, does since Manchin and Sinema need the bipartisan box checked, does everything fall apart? Well, we're going to get into all of that. And then we're also going to get into the fact that, Democrats begged and pleaded for Republicans to have a 9/11 commission, a Jan 6 commission that they would have veto rights over, and they wouldn't. And so now Nancy Pelosi is saying, okay, fine, we're just going to do a real investigation. So great, you had your chance, too late. And that, I guess, is going to get voted on this afternoon. We're recording this episode at noon. We started a few minutes after noon on Wednesday, so it's happening Wednesday afternoon. Presumably that just goes through on a straight partisan vote, but a lot of dynamics to discuss there. We're going to get to get to your reader questions, and we may even we'll probably remind you of our theme song contest, which like we're really getting a lot of entries now, coming in like fast and furious. But before that, remember that the Josh Marshall podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. Grady's Cold Brew is here to help. Actually, wait a second. I've read this a few times. You know what? There's multiple summer Grady's ad copy. So I'm not going to be like a creature of habit here and just keep reading the same one. Experience the freshest way to cold brew the summer with Grady's Cold Brew Kit. The ultra convenient all in one kit comes packed with Grady's famous New Orleans style coffee blend of 100% Arabica beans and imported French chicory. No need for any equipment, just add water to the reusable spigot pouch to brew 36 cups of bold, velvety smooth iced coffee. And the best part, no more waiting in lines or paying coffee shop prices. Grady's pours directly from your fridge and costs less than $1 a cup. If you're ready to give it a swirl, get 25% off your first order at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. That's Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. I was gonna, we're now all in that phase where um as annoying it is as it is to pay those jacked up coffee shop prices and not get the great deal you get on Grady's Cold Brew, and wait in lines and all that kind of stuff, that some of us are kind of like, man, I'm kind of nostalgic for waiting in lines because I've spent a year and a half sitting in my house drinking Grady's, which is great. But it's people want to socialize, so it's okay if you want to go to a coffee shop a few times because we're supposedly we're coming out of this pandemic, and that's a whole other, not something I think we're going to talk about a great deal today, but that kind of remains sort of the topic of the year, of everything right now. It's such a I don't know everybody else, but there are few times in your life when you live through big historical events, like big historical events, ones that are kind of even hard to imagine. And like, you have something like 20 years ago, you had something like 9/11. That was a big, big historical event. And in some ways, its greatest impact is the things that came in its wake. The U.S. invaded Afghanistan. The U.S. invaded Iraq. I mean, we can get into why there was any, why that led to us invading Iraq. But the reality is it did. And yet, for the vast majority of people in the country, 9/11 is just something they watched on TV, really. But this is like everybody, everybody in the country kind of locked down. And now we're kind of getting back to things that were just totally normal. So anyway, a lot going on. Kate, please stop
Not
me
going
before I talk for the entire episode.
on. Well, I think we'll start with infrastructure, which has been kind of a day-to-day roller coaster since it was announced that the bipartisan group of senators in the White House had agreed on a deal on the framework. And then the contents of that deal became clear in the next days, but kind of the emotional journey of this agreement so far and the complementary reconciliation bill has been, just kind of interesting to witness. I was on the Hill a couple times last week, but I was there on Thursday, and I caught up with Senator Tom Tillis from North Carolina kind of shortly after that Rose Garden event you mentioned, where there were 5 Republicans, um, kind of heralding the deal and a great, claps for bipartisanship event kind of thing. And we wanted to be sure that the other Republicans who were the negotiators on that deal were still all in, and trying to discern, was that event just that those 5 were just being ambassadors for the whole group, or kind of had the others had a change of heart. And so I talked to Tillis, and he was like, all for it, plan to support it, glad Biden came out endorsing it kind of thing. And then minutes after, you know, we saw the statement from Lindsey Graham, who was also one of the negotiators in that group, saying outraged that.
Was Graham before McConnell?
Yeah,
Who
he
put out this?
was.
Okay, I wasn't sure about that because
Mhm.
I had. I mean, you were there. I wasn't paying that close attention, but at least the thing that registered to me first was when McConnell put out his statement.
Yeah.
But Graham went
I'm
first.
pretty sure it was Graham first because
You would know. I was not paying it that close attention to the timing.
yeah, because I wanted to talk to him too, but he was on the phone when he walked by me. And anyway, kind of outraged at being, quote unquote, extorted. The idea that all of a sudden Democrats have decided to link the bipartisan deal and the reconciliation bill, and that they kind of, McConnell took the same posture that they were hoodwinked. Like, we thought we were working on this bipartisan deal in good faith, and then you pull out this partisan bill out of nowhere, and all this kind of stuff. And now the root of that, just to put everyone on the same page, is that Democrats want to make sure that they're keeping both the progressive and moderate factions of the party together on both of these bills. And the way to do that, that they've decided, is to link the two, meaning that hopefully they're trying to get progressive votes on the bipartisan deal, um, but while assuring those progressives that a vote on that scaled down bill does not preclude the more ambitious reconciliation bill. Um, and that by linking the two, they're also trying to guarantee that moderates don't just kind of slink away after getting a win on the bipartisan deal and decide they don't want to stomach a 4, 5, $6 trillion reconciliation package, however big that may be. So Democratic leadership, to give them credit, has really not been coy about this at all. And as Pelosi made clear, we will not consider the bipartisan bill in the House until we see the reconciliation bill as well. So that was the posture they took. Republicans are feigning this outrage, which really is feigning, because there's no doubt that everybody knew that this was how it was going to work. I put out an article a few days ago that kind of laid out the distinct on the record examples we have of McConnell, Roy Blunt, Cassidy, all
And
these
like almost
Republicans.
suggesting it at some
Right.
point, not just like saying yes, we know that's happening, almost like saying, hey, why don't you do this?
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So
being like, "Work with us on this and then do whatever you want in reconciliation." Like, that was not a controversial thing to say until
right.
Democrats kind of made their strategy, I don't know, reemphasize the strategy after the deal.
Yeah, I think. Well, I guess one part of this that is sort of it's certainly not the most important part, but this whole idea of you're extorting us, you kind of you pulled a fast one, we agreed, and suddenly you're adding conditions, all this kind of stuff. This idea of extorting is the mechanics of it are just weird at a certain level because Democrats aren't adding any conditions to Republicans. They're not saying like, oh, suddenly you've got to do this, or kind of like, we're only going to, I'll veto your bipartisan bill if you don't also vote for our reconciliation. It, it is an agreement with other Democrats.
Mhm.
It assumes that Republicans are going to aggressively oppose and politic against and everything the reconciliation bill. So set aside that they knew it was happening, all that kind of stuff. The extorting thing is just, again, logic is sort of the least important part of these things, but it's just kind of weird because it doesn't ask that. It just has nothing to do with them. It's sort of like, I mean, maybe if you want to use that language, maybe they're extorting Joe Manchin,
Yeah,
but like,
right?
it's one of the sort of the side weirdnesses to this whole thing.
No, that's absolutely one of my kind of favorite parts of this dynamic, because usually when you have something that is clearly politically disadvantageous to the party, they try, both parties do this, but they try to put on some kind of public facing argument that is more than just, this is going to be a win for the other side and we don't want to see that. You usually try
Right.
to concoct something that's like, oh, bipartisanship or honesty in negotiations, which they're doing kind of, but exactly what you're saying. You poke it a little bit and you're like, the only way this is extortion is if, you're basically dead set against giving the president a win on both of these pieces of legislation, which they are, but it's just kind of funny to have that be the private argument and basically also the
The
public
public
facing
argument.
argument.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I guess I mean, there's certainly, and this is what is so weird and fluid about these negotiations, that there was a major argument among Republicans, or, not argument in the sense of controversy, but one of their arguments was, hey, let's be kind of generous on this bipartisan bill, in relative terms, and we'll sabotage the rest of it, because we'll kind of we'll put the moderates in a position that they'll say, hey, this is pretty good, maybe this is enough, we're doing a lot, like we don't need that other thing, and you'll kind of not only will you, as Republicans, prevent a big bill, you will also sort of turn the Democratic Party against itself, create this big factional battle, which both parties are always trying to do. You're always trying to kind of find find the fissures within within your opposite party and exploit them and draw them out. You know, that's normal. So that was kind of their plan. And my sense is that, I guess we have the why McConnell let this get so far question coming up, don't we?
Right.
Okay, so we'll leave to that. But I have my own ideas about, um, just what were all the different players thinking here when
Right.
you got to that purported deal, right?
Right.
A
Yeah.
week ago,
And then I guess the other events we should just kind of hit on the infrastructure talks is over the weekend, Joe Biden put out a statement, which a lot of people have characterized as a walk back. That's not really how I read it, but basically clarifying statements he made, where he basically said that he would not sign the bipartisan deal without the reconciliation bill, which
right?
is, like we said, that's essentially what Pelosi said. That's kind of also the posture of Democratic leadership. But I guess the Republicans, particularly those involved in the negotiations, went bananas and, got mad about it. And reportedly, Biden and his team kind of spent the weekend working the phones, making sure the bipartisan deal didn't crumble on the spot. And
Right.
then he put out this really long statement where, what I kind of took away from it is he's reemphasizing the linkage of those two bills. I think a lot of people focused on the one line he said, which was that he wouldn't veto the bipartisan bill, if it
He
gets to
wouldn't
his
sign it.
desk.
Right, right, right. In the follow up, yes, yes,
Right,
yes,
in the
yes,
follow up.
yes, yeah,
But the majority of that statement was all about how he sees those two things as connected. And even though he kind of shifted the onus back onto Congress to, send him the bills, which,
yeah.
he should, but I would not call it a walk back, but that's kind of
Well, I think it's a walk. It is, because I did a few posts about this, that by Sunday or Monday you had, like, places like Axios or Politico or whatever saying, like, the dramatic walk
mhm,
back and dramatic reversal of policy that he sprung on everybody. I mean, what it really comes down to is that if you thought, um, it wasn't really a walk back, and the fact that it was not a walk back is because there really wasn't a walk forward. And so if you want to invest a lot in these, you know semantic shadings that was largely, um made up by Republicans, that, yes, then it is a walk back. But in fact, what makes it seem not really like a walk back, and I think that is basically the reality of the situation, is that everybody knew there was linkage. Everybody knew it. Democrats said it constantly. Republicans maybe weren't crazy about it, but they understood it. That was the, that was the basis on which they made this deal. And he added this thing, well, I won't sign it if only one. But I mean, that is kind of moot, because only one bill isn't going to come to his desk. And so he said that, kind of, okay, I won't veto it. But again, that was always like a notional thing. That was never a hypothetical that was going to come to pass. So in practice, he just he I guess that to the extent that there may be one Republican who felt not surprised, but maybe put in a bit of a tough position. Kind of, you're making it a little too clear we're working together here. You're making it a little too clear that we are helping you indirectly do your reconciliation bill because you've got some moderates who want a bipartisan thing, and kind of like, okay, we're willing to do it, but don't say it quite that directly because you're putting me in a bad spot because you're 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 making me part of you getting this done. And kind of like for those people who kind of in some sense maybe genuinely felt that it wasn't just kind of like a McConnell Graham put up job, that kind of if you say, okay, I won't veto it, kind of will toss you a little bone, even though, as you said, Kate, you spending a fairly long statement basically saying, yep, they're linked,
Right.
and I'm definitely getting both.
And then, Mitch McConnell kind of wasted no time in spinning the statement as a walk back and then called on Pelosi and Schumer to, delink the two pieces of legislation, basically asking, give me back the power to make it more likely that reconciliation dies by taking away your leverage with the moderates in your caucus, basically, was the long
Yeah.
story short of that statement.
So where do you think this? I mean, like I said, it's not at all clear to me there were ever 11 senators supporting this thing. And what has virtually all of those 11, at least the ones who talked to the press, have put out statements like, "Oh, this was an outrage," and "Oh, we need assurances." Oh, and "Oh, oh, oh," but no one has said, "All right, I'm done. I'm
Right.
voting against this thing." And so, do we have a sense of kind of what is where this is?
Well, it's funny because on top of kind of how fluid and rapidly changing the situation is, the Senate also left for a 2-week recess on Friday. So it's really hard to kind of
And
nail
didn't they just
down
come
where
back
people
from
are.
recess like a week before?
The summer is riddled with recesses. We also have the big
Yeah,
August one coming up. But
right,
when they're kind of back in their states, that means you have to go through their spokespeople, which
right.
means you're not going to get a lot of information. So, it's not entirely clear to me. I think I have the same impression you do that there were kind of an initial flurry of, well, I was blindsided by this. And then, I think one of our writers kind of rounded up some statements over the weekend of people, Republicans expressing, gladness that Biden had, clarified his remarks kind of thing. But, I don't think that was still, I don't think that I've seen the number that we would need to pass. So it's kind of, and now that McConnell is orienting himself against it, that always throws things more into flux because you just don't have a lot of members who are willing to cross McConnell when he kind of points them in one direction.
Yeah, and it also goes both ways. Is that McConnell's also not going to get ahead of his caucus.
Right.
So if he is kind of thumbs down, that is a pretty good indication that that's where his caucus is, and he's going to try to make everybody stays on side in kind of where the caucus wants to go. So they both. I know I'm not telling you this. This is
Mm-hmm.
telling our listeners this. It goes both ways.
Right.
He is both an indicator of where the caucus is and a kind of a director of where it is going to go. Now, the thing that struck me um, was this Joe Manchin was on TV a couple days ago, and he
Mm-hmm.
made this what seemed like a kind of an offhand statement, but to me was in some ways the most significant thing that we have seen um, since that press conference outside the White House. Or was it outside or inside? Not that this
Outside.
matters at all, but I'm losing track. Is that he basically the I think it was Stephanie Rule on MSNBC, but whoever it was basically said, what's the deal? Is the bipartisan deal done? Is the apple cart upset? And Manchin basically said, look, we're going we're eventually probably gonna have to pile a lot of this stuff into reconciliation. It is what it is. We got to kind of work through that bipartisan thing. But the sum I took from that is he is not he is not waiting for Lindsey Graham to give the thumbs up to the Biden agenda. And that is that is the sort of the fundamental thing that is important to remember here. This is an argument among Democrats. It involves Republicans because the different Democrats have things that they want Republicans to do to make, to kind of be part of. It's sort of like, you have a chess match being played between two Democrats, and there are Republican chess pieces, but the actual discussion is between Democrats. So Joe Manchin can always, this doesn't involve, the sacrosanct filibuster. This is kind of the squishier, we want to be nice, we want to be bipartisan. So if there are only 6 Republicans who want to support that bill and McConnell's turned against it, he can always say, like, okay, we had our deal, and, like, if you're pulling out of the deal, we're just going to do it all through reconciliation. Now, I'm not saying that is an easy thing that he just does that presto. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of drama and stuff like that. But that to me was a pretty important tell that he is not wanting to say, "Oh, we everything's got to stop where it is until we can beg and plead and get Lindsey Graham to sign on to this thing."
Yeah, and that kind of does lead into the other point I wanted to talk about with infrastructure is that there have been a couple comments from Democrats this week, particularly kind of about reconciliation that have struck me. The first being from Senator Tim Kaine, who sits on the budget committee, who made a comment to reporters while he was the only senator presiding over the chamber because they need one poor soul to do it while they're on recess. So they usually pick someone from, Virginia or Maryland who can get there easily. Anyway, it was him. And he told reporters that if the bipartisan deal falls apart, that they're basically just going to wrap its proposals into the reconciliation bill. And, kind of made a point of being like, we're going to have Democrat and Republican priorities in this package, which when I first saw it, I was kind of blown back on my heels because you're like, why? Why would you take kind of watered down proposals negotiated with Republicans and put it into a package that is not going to get any Republican votes? Why give them kind of a win and get nothing from them in return?
Right.
And then I think a day later, Biden made some comments about basically saying there's not going to be any extra hard infrastructure money in reconciliation that is not part of the bipartisan deal, kind of divorced from, well, I guess, in his hypothetical, it's more the bipartisan deal is passing.
Right. Well, I
But
think
either way,
yeah.
it's
Well,
kind of the same thing.
yeah, I guess in some ways that is their way to kind of take any initiative away from Republicans. Like, as far as they're concerned, yeah, we got a deal. It's passing. Nothing to talk about. And if we say that and Lindsey Graham goes out there and says something to the press and throws that in doubt, well, okay, fine. We'll just pass the exact same thing. The the bipartisan bill we all agreed to, we're just going to pile it into reconciliation and whatever. Now, here's the question that I have, though. It seemed the big question to me, and in some cases, in some ways, big because it is so important, but also because it has not been entirely clear to me where it fits into the soft hard dichotomy, is climate. Now, my general sense is that the bipartisan deal is pretty light on the climate front. And again, climate means lots of different things. I mean, climate, if you're surface rail. is light rail and is part of the climate equation, but so is retrofitting everybody's house, that kind of all that kind of stuff. So what's the story on the climate part of this?
Yeah, I would say in my conversations last week with progressives, particularly, Bernie Sanders, who's the chairman of the budget committee, so has a lot of kind of power and influence over what the reconciliation bill looks like, have said, unequivocally, you are not going to have the 50 votes you need for reconciliation unless we do climate change.
And
So,
and is am I basically right that most of the, to the extent that this was a big, a lot of climate stuff proposed, mostly that's not in the bipartisan bill?
if at all, yeah.
Okay. All right. All right. So yeah, I mean, I kind of, I certainly know, like a couple weeks ago, there was Senator Whitehouse put out a statement, kind of saying, "Hey, I'm th- I'm getting the feeling that climate is getting left out of the equation here."
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, I mean, kind of, I get the sense that, I mean, I don't know exactly what Biden was committing himself to there. And we've got to remember that, like, all these, you're sort of, you're getting the trains all to come through the station, and the station is Joe Manchin, and Joe Manchin comes from a
Hmm.
fossil fuel state. Now, having said that, there's fossil fuel states and there's fossil fuel states. He's from a coal state, and the reality is, for all of us who care deeply about climate, we need to get rid of coal, but we can't, but we need to also understand that getting rid of coal is a big deal when your state is is a coal state. That's just a reality. You've got to, there's certain people going to take the hit more than others. But I guess my the part of that I'm a little unclear on is, it's no sweat off anybody in West Virginia's back if you're retrofitting, you know, retrofitting homes for climate change. That has nothing to do with coal. I mean, nothing at all. And, to the extent you're pushing electric vehicles, coal creates electricity, right? We don't want it to create as much, electric, but a lot of this stuff really has nothing to do with coal. And I think, at least, that there was that pretty surprising statement a few months ago by the guy who's the head of the coal, United Mine Workers. Once one of the biggest, most powerful unions in the country, now a minuscule. Just, there's not a lot of miners left. Basically, he was for it, and at least as I interpreted it, he was for it, but wanted to basically kind of give coal a little time to die, basically. And I think the phrase they used was like a just transition. Um, and that's basically kind of like, I think, them realizing there is no future in the coal industry, but you have tons of retirees who have pensions that are in various ways, that need funding. You have the current miners, and you got to make them whole somehow. In any case, that's still, I think we're going to have a big fight here in the relatively near future within the Democratic Party, um, where you've got a lot of Senate Democrats, a lot of Democrats in Congress in general, and certainly around the country, is like, we're not leaving climate out of this. We're just not. And I mean, just to me, the the climate stuff is more important than the social spending stuff. I think you absolutely need both. But, like, we could go another 10 years without big process on the carrying economy. I'm not at all saying that isn't hugely important, but we actually cannot go 10 years without this climate stuff. It is it's the difference between very necessary and existential. And they're gonna have to figure out a way to make that work. Not
Yeah, I
totally sure
mean,
what it is.
I don't know where the White House concern came from exactly, just because, like I say, progressives have really not been coy about the fact that they're not going to vote for reconciliation if there's not climate in it. But I wonder if, and this kind of ties into what we're talking about, on that same Sunday show hit that Manchin did that you referenced, he gave his ballpark as what he wants the reconciliation package to be at
Yeah,
$2 trillion.
yeah,
You know, Bernie has been floating 6 trillion, though even he admitted, it's probably not going to be able to be that big.
yeah,
But part of this kind of, I think what's going to be a long and bloody road to getting this done is going to be fights on what gets cut, because the
yeah.
package is going to have to be small enough that you get Joe Manchin on board, but big enough that you don't make progressives so mad that they won't vote for the package at all.
And there too, I think, you had that piece a couple maybe yesterday, basically saying like, no, it's just the filibuster is just about Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. There aren't a
Hmm.
bunch of like shadow people who aren't, kind of coming clean or something like that. But on the on the scope of these programs thing, it's not just Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema. $6 trillion is a ton of money, and you are going to have a lot of Democrats in Congress who are like, "Hey, that's too much. 3 trillion, 4 trillion, not 6 trillion." And as you said, even Sanders gets that wisely. He's starting. He's not negotiating against himself.
Right.
He's starting with what he thinks is necessary. So I am cautiously optimistic that he's putting out two. Again, Manchin's not going to negotiate against himself either. You come together three, maybe four, and and yeah, there's going to be a lot of stuff there. But it's kind of it's sort of it feels to me like my thinking is with For the People Act about gerrymandering. Like gerrymandering is the thing. You need that. The other stuff is super important. You absolutely need the gerrymandering stuff. And to me, kind of like again, climate and hard infrastructure in my mind are almost they're the same thing. You cannot accomplish anything on climate without funding the new way people will drive around,
Right.
will get around. So that's hanging out there. That's going to be a big deal. We probably
Yeah.
get to questions, shouldn't we?
Yes.
Yeah.
Briefly, we were going to just note, and I'll run through it really fast, the January 6th Select Committee, which they're
Yes.
voting on today. Um, Long story short, it's going to be 13 members. Pelosi gets final say on all of them. 5 of them she's going to consult with McCarthy about. And then the chair gets unilateral subpoena power, which is a change from the independent commission, which required Republican cooperation to issue subpoenas, which a lot of people were like, okay, well, this is going to be a pretty big problem right off the bat. So, in those
And was a
ways,
huge opportunity for Republicans
right. So I
since they
think
had a veto over anything.
exactly. So I think in those ways, a lot of people's issues with the commission have been kind of addressed in this version. We'll probably see it, like you say, pass along party lines. I can't imagine there are going to be honestly more than maybe 5 defections from House Republicans this time. And kind of after this event, which is not, doesn't have a super lot of suspense because we pretty much know how it's going to go. But after that, all eyes are going to be on who they pick to staff the committee, basically. They're to fill out the committee. And, I've been in touch with a senior Democratic aide who kind of confirmed to me that Pelosi is reserving the right to kind of veto any of McCarthy's suggestions. So that's going to be an interesting dynamic. We'll see um, if he tries to suggest people who are, big lie spreaders themselves, who Pelosi will pick. There's been some uh, some chatter that she might want to pick a Republican herself, but that she would pick, a Liz Cheney or an Adam Kinzinger, which then will set off another flurry of speculation about if that person that she picks who accepts the role is not running for reelection, because that's kind of, a potential big blow against their
Digging
political
themselves deeper.
future.
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So
Although
anyway,
it's also potentially sort of an off ramp for someone
right.
if they
S-
know they're going to get driven out of office. Like
Right.
that's kind of an opportunity.
So those are all kind of the next steps that we'll be watching after the commission passes this afternoon. And, that's something that in future episodes, I'm sure we will return to and analyze. But in the meantime, on to questions. Our first is from Josh. Saying regarding Josh Marshall's post asking why McConnell let the infrastructure talks get this far. Is it possible he didn't have a choice? Meaning, if he had made it clear from the beginning that it's a tiny bipartisan deal that doesn't come close to what Dems were asking for, or nothing, would that have risked pushing Manchin to accept doing everything via reconciliation? At least now he can push the double cross nonsense and hope it riles up West Virginia enough to spook Manchin.
I think that's right. I mean, look, I talked to right after or actually just before that press conference where they announced the deal, where the deal was out there. They hadn't had the press conference, but we knew what was happening. I was talking to a person who's longtime staffer, someone who was up there for years and years and years, retired from up there relatively recently, and this person was like, "What doesn't fit here? Like, there's no way that McConnell's supporting this. So how did we get here?" And that is a basic question. But I think the answer is, look, a lot of McConnell's genius at this kind of stuff is just playing for time. And as the reader noted, he if he just said, okay, here's our offer, $1, he's gonna kind of he's going to push Manchin and Sinema into a position where he's just kind of, you know, shoving it down their throats that kind of like, no, there is absolutely no deal, absolutely nothing. And everything goes into reconciliation. And there are, even in this, degraded version of the Republican Party, there's still some people there who say, hey, man, that's not okay. We need an infrastructure bill. We at least don't want to appear to be, saying no to anything. So I think he is, was kind of letting these talks proceed, and McConnell is not the dictator of the Senate Republican caucus. It's a consensus position, and I think he was managing all those things, and they get to a deal, and I think that is not necessarily where he wanted to be, but okay, and keep playing for time. It's not really a deal. It's a framework. So there's a lot of time to play games, and I think they kind of it was a little off course in his mind, and he sees Biden say this thing, and they're like, "Ah, okay, here we go. Here we go. Let's try to blow it up." And that's what happened. So to a certain extent, yes, he had no choice. Um, but he's always playing for time, and no deal is really a deal until it's voted on. So he had a lot of time left to play, and we see that he immediately came up with a pretext why it was a betrayal, and he's going to pull back the football. So I think that's basically it.
I do think there also might have been some underestimating of the toughness of Democratic leaders here, because even though they always planned to do these two things, the bipartisan and the reconciliation, they came out really, really strong after this deal was reached, saying
And
unequivocally,
before the press conference,
yeah,
like
saying,
right to kind of
right,
cue up the press conference.
right, saying unequivocally, we will not kind of let this bipartisan bill pass, herald it as this big achievement, and then wait to do reconciliation down the road, thus endangering reconciliation, thus giving moderates an off ramp. Even if it still means, the bipartisan bill is still going to be notching a legislative victory for Biden and for Democrats, and giving Biden kind of the bipartisan bona fides that he loves. But,
Hmm.
they kind of, I think in this way, really kind of stood by the progressives, and said, we're not going to leave you out to dry. These two things are happening together. This is a tandem exercise. And for a party that I think sometimes falls on its sword a bit, it was pretty gutsy. And I
Yeah,
think
they they
McConnell
they
might have underestimated
I
that.
think they hang tougher than he expected.
Hmm.
I think that's right. And that is for everybody who's gotten kind of like, demoralized and everything. That is important to see that he kind of thought that I'm going to roll them here and they queued up that press conference saying, "You know what? Nope, you're not." And
Right.
and, and some of that is yeah, to saying to progressives like, because everybody's got to hold hands really tight in a party in a situation like this, to basically them saying like, yes, this is gonna you're gonna feel a little wobbly here, like, does anybody have our backs? And we're saying like, yeah, 100%. That thing you are afraid of, where the moderates get together and cut a deal with Republicans, and that's it. That is not going to happen. And I think that is an example both of giving hard reassurance to the party's progressive wing, but also just generally. You're not going to pull that bullshit you pulled with us back in 2009 and 2010. We learned that
Right.
lesson. It's not going to happen.
And I think it is important because just being at the Hill and watching the kind of emotional state of progressives, by the time they left for recess, there wasn't a lot of panic. They were kind of in a state of, absolutely determined, like, we will not be hosed by moderates on this. But it wasn't a position of, you know, I'm really worried. We got to get leadership on board. It was more, I would say they left for recess as unified as one could possibly hope for when you're talking about a unified caucus that includes Joe Manchin and Bernie Sanders.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, my sense is that they kind of after this 7-day period that we're talking about, um, kind of everybody seems to feel and be telegraphing, kind of like, okay, there's going to be a lot of bumps coming, and I'm not going to get everything I want, but like we've sort of got a plan here together. No one's going to get sort of like booted off the train before it gets to the station. We're all going to get bumped together. We're all going to lose a few things, but we're kind of in this together. And that's really, as you say, that's what you need as a caucus.
Right. I mean, and we'll see what happens when we get into the particulars of the bill, but it's been an entire term of catering to Joe Manchin and the moderates for obvious political reasons. But progressives are not the ones who have been putting the brakes on Biden's agenda, demanding more in line with their own values. They've been the ones
Well,
who are kind of been team players so far.
yeah, I mean, I think the other point to, in fairness, to remember there is it has been a 6 months of catering to Joe Manchin in the interests of passing what's basically the progressives' agenda.
Totally.
Bernie Sanders, a lot of our readers are going to say, hey, there's a bunch of other stuff we wanted too. But I mean, Biden put forward a very aggressive, very progressive agenda. So yes, tons of butlering uh, Joe Manchin, but again, in the interest of a bill that is not the maximal bill for progressives, but a lot. It
Right.
is their agenda that is what's getting worked on here.
Right.
All right. So next question.
Our next question is from Joe, who says, in the latest podcast, Josh made a reference to the mainstream DC media being wired for Republicans. He's made the same point a number of times in the editor's blog in posts about the media running with the GOP's nonsensical Biden con us infrastructure whining. This is pretty clearly true, but why?
It's funny when Kate showed me this question, I thought great question, but then I thought, oh no, because I'm not sure I have a great answer for it. So I'm kind of setting myself up. But here's my answer. I think that when I started saying this was almost like 20 years ago, and 20 years ago, it's important to remember where things were in the late 90s. You had two-term Democratic president, but you were coming off a few decades of the Nixon presidency, the Reagan presidency, the first Bush presidency. Republicans took over the Congress in 1995. It's not just my thing is it's not the DC press. It's DC. DC is wired for Republicans, and 15, 20 years ago, that was to a great extent because dominance of the government leads to dominance of the city. People go and they become the lobbyists and all the kind of stuff, and it was just wired for Republican assumptions, wired with Republican personnel, blah 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 blah. Now, in the interim, we have had we had the Obama presidency. We had at least brief periods of big Democratic majorities in Congress. So that part of the argument is a little more attenuated, even though it is still much more true than one might think. But the other part of it is, I think it is also just an artifact, kind of carrying more of that weight now, is the kind of the both sides structure of mainstream media political reporting, which is to say that if your mindset is you basically have to take what each side is saying at face value because both sides, that gives some inherent advantage to the group that is willing to make stuff up more. So I think that is a a much greater part of it now, but it is also that thing of the personnel who runs the city, and what sense of expectations um, they run on. Let me give an example. I have little doubt that if you polled most of the people who work at Politico and Axios, they're not partisan Republicans. They're not partisan Democrats, but I mean, their basic set of like, do you support this? Do you support that? All these kind of things. They probably do lean Democratic, but that doesn't translate into Democratic assumptions in reporting, nor should it. If anything, it leads the opposite direction. It actually there's a compensation thing. But whatever the reasons, it was very striking after that Biden press conference last week, after Lindsey Graham made a statement, after Mitch McConnell made a statement about the betrayal and stunned and shocked and whatever. I spent a lot of time, certainly too much time, on Twitter, just kind of seeing what everybody's saying and, falling prey to my ego and adding my thoughts kind of too much of the time. And what was striking is like all the reporters that I follow, and they're the people who work at these places, they're all saying like, "Oh, come on, we knew there was linkage." Blah blah. Kind of. Oh my God, what is this? What is that? Oh my God. And then all those places ran articles basically saying, "Oh my God, the Republicans were just caught off guard by this stunned." So you see it translate. And I had some people say, "Well, it's the publications are owned by big money people, and they're Republicans." Well, yeah, but that's not. It doesn't. It's not a direct correlation. So, uh, I don't feel like I the reasons why that is the case now are really multifaceted and hard to explain and also hard to understand. And I don't mean like hard for me to explain, hard for you to understand, hard for me to understand. But that's, I think, the best quick answer I can give to the question.
Yeah, and I'd add, I have been in the journalism world for, a shorter amount of time than Josh, but in kind of the modern, especially the Trump era, I think there was this feeling that obviously the press was under attack all the time. And, you know, calling the press biased and stooges of the left and, you know, the DNC and all that kind of stuff. And I do think there was this attempt to show if
We were never
journalists were
biased.
also tough
Yeah.
on Republicans, that you could win those people back, that you could show, no, we're not. We're not working for Democrats. See, we're
You mean
tough on
also
Democrats.
also tough on Democrats?
Oh, that's what I meant.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
If we go after, if we criticize Biden the same amount we criticize Trump, then you will see unequivocally that we are neutral, that we are fair, that we are balanced. And the reality is, it doesn't matter how many articles that these outlets run criticizing Biden. The people who have kind of written off everyone but OAN as fake news and an apparatus of the Democrats is never going to come around. So these
Right.
efforts are kind of fruitless, but you do have this effort to show, to kind of disprove Trump's notion that journalists are working for Democrats by redoubling efforts to criticize Democrats, or to kind of highlight their mistakes. And I think it's kind of all in search of proving this balance that is pretty damaging ultimately, especially now while we have one party that the majority of it is pretty actively working to undermine the democracy. So just treating that party like they're just the other side of the coin to the Democrats, and going after Democrats to show that you're a neutral arbiter, it just does have, I think, dangerous knock-on effects beyond kind of the fruitless attempt to convince people who've written off the press as nefarious that we're actually not.
Yeah, I mean, I would say for with the benefit or the burden of longer historical experience, that what you were describing about the Trump era is just a more extreme and concentrated version of really the last 40 to 50 years in American politics. That, Trump was saying, fake news, working for kind of lock them up. I mean, really kind of crazy, the sort of stuff you expect to hear from like a right wing autocrat in a non democratic country. But before that, Republicans for decades have been saying the biased mainstream media, liberal bias, blah 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 blah. Again, a much softer thing, but still creating that dynamic where you have the mainstream media reacting to that by trying to bend over backwards to prove they're not biased. And you have the same dynamic you describe, which is to say there's always this, well, maybe we'll prove it, we'll you know we'll bend over backwards, every time we can, if there's any legitimate criticism, we'll criticize Democrats, and maybe we'll prove it. Well, obviously you're not going to prove it because it's not based on a misunderstanding in the first place. It's just working the refs, and you just keep working the refs. So there is, as you say, there is this dynamic coming off Trump. Look, we were never anti-Trump. We were just hardcore journalists. So we're going to show it. We're going to prove it now by showing we can be just as tough on Democrats. That's exactly what it is. But that's also exactly what it's been for the last 45 years or so, just with dialed up to 6 or 7, and Trump dialed it up to 11, basically. But the dynamic is the same.
All right.
Anyway, all right. So let me, as we conclude this episode of the Josh Marshall Podcast, let me remind you that the Josh Marshall Podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee and their uber awesome cold brew kit, which you can buy. And remember that you can get 25% off your first order of Grady's at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. All
All
right.
right. Remember, send us your questions and your podcast theme song submissions to talk@talkingpointsmemo.com. Thanks for both of those. We've gotten really good ones in both those categories. So keep them coming.
Cool. All
All
right.
right. See you
Later.
next week.
Bye.